Everyone's gangster till Claymore Roomba comes around the corner. Age of paranoia saying. Nobody thinks that they're the villain of the story. Confederate philosophical belief. Bitch, please. I'm from the government. I'm not here to help. The detainee's rebuttal. The matron looked up from the file folder she was reading, staring at the man across the room from her.
Non era logical defects.
Your personality core threading is stable. The refusion of roughly 16,000 templates is now smoothed and buffed better than a whore's shaved muffin, the matron said. The man nodded, lifting up his hand and looking at it. He turned it over, looking at the pale palm, then back to look at the darker back. He lowered his hand and looked at the matron. I feel good. Better than I can remember feeling in a long time. Since before you were forced to eat your legs to survive? The matron asked. There was no cruelty in her voice, no mocking, just a statement of fact. The man nodded. Better than I've felt since I started work on the Intellect Preservation and Recovery Project, he said. He lifted up a cup of cocoa with froth and small marshmallows in it and sipped at it. Your body is stable, no neural scorching or nerve fiber unraveling, she stated. She closed the folder and lit a cigarette. For a moment, all that was visible of her face were her cold gunmetal grey eyes staring at the man through the smoke. And what did we learn? Don't hot alter your own Suds record and hot load it into your own brain, the man said, giving a wry chuckle. Don't alter Suds records at all. The matron nodded. Good. There was silence broken only by the crackling and popping of the fire in the ornate stone fireplace. How long? The man asked. A long time. The system was offline due to an unscheduled Big Bang super event. That's been repaired, but once I placed the heralds of the Traveller's Path, we went into Standerby, the matron said. She picked up her own steaming cup of coffee mixed with cocoa and sipped at it primly. She set down the cup with a clink. I got a look at the stars cape outside. A long time has passed without us. How long? The man repeated. Over 35,000 years. She tapped on finger on the side of the cup, her enamelled nail clicking against porcelain. They needed us several times. That bad? The man asked. He picked up a red and white swirled candy stick and stirred his cocoa, then took another sip of the cocoa. As bad as it can get without xenocide, the matron said. She sipped at her cocoa. The Confederacy still stands, but it's on its knees. The man nodded. All right. Well, you obviously didn't unthaw me to save the Confederacy and have me ride with Thok to save Santa. The matron gave a snort. No. She stared at him for a moment. I need some names. The man frowned. What names? Who worked on the Gestalt system's core threading and Tier 0 architecture? The matron answered. The man shook his head. They were all killed in the glassing. They were here, but they got wiped out. He looked at her for a moment. Unless you're done processing records. She sighed.
No.
I'm a long way from done. Being put on standby interrupted a lot of my endless toil. I'm only roughly 60% done, mostly the later stuff, barring some of the real shit shows. The man nodded. All right. I'll give you the names. You're looking at close to 200 people. Writing code in my era wasn't like in your time. Coding sections were often outsourced to code farms that had thousands of projects, under fake headers and shell companies. Hundreds worked on putting the code together, usually without knowing what anyone else was doing. The woman gave a growl of frustration. That's going to be a problem. What's going on? The man asked. He sipped at the cocoa and waited. Someone's accessing the system from outside, using fake headers to appear as the major Gestalt channels in conversations as well as to access population metrics data. The older, core and founding Gestalts have a lot of data access no other Gestalt, hell, maybe even no other user, has access to, the matron said. She looked out at the wood-framed window, staring at the snowflakes drifting down in the darkness. I need to know who would have that kind of access, or what it would take to gain that kind of access. The man nodded. You don't want the people who coded the backbone, he said. He closed his eyes. There's a 10-man team you want. They were in charge of Gestalt cybersecurity and did almost all the code in-house. Proprietary stuff, entirely built from the ground up, no outsourcing. The matron nodded. I'll take those names. In the meantime, I'll look at the software architecture, see if there's any problems, he stated. He looked out at the snow. Quaint. Reminds me of home, the matron said. She turned her attention back to the man. We'll be the new kids on the block again. Let me guess, you're going to help guide them, the man said. The matron laughed, a hard brittle edge to it, a slightly maddened sound. Me? God, no. They don't need my help. I just need to make sure I do my part. The man nodded. I think humanity has had enough of my help, from what I remember, Dee. The matron just shrugged. It was always going to end this way, Pete. She stood up, smoothing her dress. She moved over to the doorway, reaching out and picking a severe-cut woman's long coat from the hooks by the door. She put it on, taking the time to tug at the cuffs, check her cufflinks, and make sure it was buttoned up properly. Computers are in the back. Full access. Don't screw up, she said. She pulled a slim data tablet out of one pocket and tossed it to Pete, who caught it easily. That's linked into the system, but pretty slow. Pete just nodded as she left, walking out into the dark night. The door closed behind her. Pete sat, sipping at his cocoa and staring at the fire. Part of him wanted to rush back and start looking for things to fix. He pushed that aside. That wouldn't help anything. He powered up the data slate and made a file request. He stirred his cocoa with the peppermint candy stick as he scrolled through the error logs. Identify, diagnose, design, create, test, he thought to himself. I'll need a full team to do any work, but I should at least figure out what I'm going to task the team with. He knew there were a few things that needed checked right away. Places where patches had been applied, found out to have had major flaws. Then the patch rolled back with the next set of patches using different naming styles. He looked at a comment in one of the error logs and snorted. // add in function to require annotation to any code changes. 2 scroll swipes down he laughed out loud. // annotation requirement removed by oversight committee. He shook his head as he kept perusing the error logs. Unvarak huddled down next to the undamaged wall. There were holes in the other walls toward the top, where high-velocity large-caliber kinetic shells had blown clear through the ferrocrete, to travel across the room, and blow through the wall beyond. Unvarak's brain told him that the velocity had not been significantly lowered by a mere half-meter of ferrocrete on each wall, and the kinetic round, at least 20 millimeters in width, had probably traveled through at least a dozen more walls. Only on the wall he was crouched down next to were their craters. Those craters were fist-deep, but had not compromised the structural integrity of the wall, nor had they penetrated the molecularly bonded ferrocrete. He looked over at Taskapak, the Strevical scientist, who was busy spraying a piece of plast debris with one of his sprays. As he watched, the Strevical bent the plastic over his thigh, then grabbed another piece. Glue spray to attach the straight piece to the bent piece, another spray across the bent piece, then attaching the straight piece to the bottom of a length of straight hyperalloy scrap. An explosion shook the ruins they were in, causing dust to rise up from the dirty debris-strewn floor, off of the mouldering walls, and to drift down from the damaged ceiling. Looks like the green robots are winning, Lou, the DRA Fulton Way of the Means Guard, stated. Unvarak just nodded. Another red one is headed over here, Lou said, her voice tight. Unvarak just nodded again, looking over the locking mechanism to the heavy door he was crouching next to. He looked at Quillick, the Dremkillia miner, who was busy cutting away part of the molecularly bonded ferrocrete. "How much longer?" 163 seconds, the Dremkillia said, smiling. "Mark!" Another rippling roar of kinetic weapons being fired, the projectiles breaking the sound barrier with a loud crack by the hundreds. "How damaged is Terra Robot?" Taskapak asked. "I can see internal mechanisms," Lu stated. The DRA, Fulton scientist, was next to Unvarak, looking over the cracked keypad. "No power," he stated. "We're in trouble," the Strevikal soldier, Shrokur, stated, his voice dead and hopeless. The Strevikal scientist pulled out the tube he had spent the last several days exhaling into, uncapping the end he usually blew into. He slapped the tube on top of the arrangement and looked at Shrokur. "Soldier! CO2 laser," he snapped, tossing the arrangement of random parts to the other Strevikal. The soldier just nodded, putting the curved part on his shoulder, reaching forward and grabbing the short tube marked Bobco Food Product, Kanoyum Yum, on the side. "Soldier!" Projectile weapon, the scientist snapped, tossing a weird hodgepodge of parts to the DRA. Fulton way of the mean soldier. The DRA, Fulton caught it, looking doubtful. 50 shots. 5 rounds burst. "Do good," the Strevikal scientist snapped. The scientist then scuttled over by Unvarak, putting a weird little device on the tip of the nose of his helmet. He sniffed up the wall, stopping by where Quillick was working. "Power ends here. Suggests power lead fracture or break." Quillick just nodded, shaving out more of the ferrocrete. "Hurry, hurry, laborer," the Strevikal squeaked. The DRA, Fulton scientist, looked up. "Bypassed the system. We get power. We don't need a code. The door should open." Unvarak just nodded, looking at the piece of superconductor cable in his hands. "Get ready," Lu said, lifting up the unwieldy and crude-looking weapon. The door shattered inward, and one of the ever-present Terra robots stood in the doorway. It was vaguely shaped like a Terra skeleton, all reddish chrome metal. The chest was damaged, several plates missing, showing internal mechanisms. Shrokur fired before the debris from the door had fully tumbled to a stop, squeezing the firing lever twice. Both times a bright red laser bolt lanced out with a thunderous detonation. The robot looked at the Strevikal soldier and began limping forward, dragging one foot along the ground. Unvarak could see where the hydraulic pistons were broken and leaking, where the piston at the back of the ankle had become disconnected from the foot. The DRA, Fulton fired, the 5 rounds one loud, all-consuming roar. The robot staggered to the side. Shrokur fired again, one shit missing, the other hitting internal mechanisms. The robot staggered and the DRA. Fulton ran forward, jamming the barrel of the makeshift weapon into the gap and squeezing the trigger. The robot backhanded her across the room, leaving her in a crumpled heap, then went still. The momentum turned it slightly, leaving it facing the wall. It stood unmoving. "Power leads exposed," Quillick stated, moving back. "Good, good, move, move, move," Taskapak said, waving his hands at the Dremkillia. Quillick moved aside, and the disheveled-looking scientist moved up and started sniffing the wires of the motor impeller behind the keypad. "Yes, yes, 2.4386 amps times 10 to the negative 6 amperes, the scientist said. He started sniffing the wires of the hole.
No. No.
Times 10 to the negative 3. No. Unvarak looked as Lu glanced out of the hole in the wall. "More robots coming." 6, she said. She looked at the weapon. "I have maybe 6 shots left in this thing." 7, Taskapak squealed.
No.
"Too many. Too few." 10 to the negative 4.
No.
There was a sudden rumble that made Unvarak cringe away from the middle of the room. "What fresh torment is this?" Shrucker asked from where he was crouched down behind a piece of debris that had once been a fairly large machine before it had fallen through the ceiling and the floors above. A crack appeared in the ground. "They're getting close," Lu said, looking back out of the crater. She ducked down. "Damn it, they saw me." Long taloned fingers thrust up out of the glowing red crack, curling to hold onto the edges. The crack began to widen, making the ground tremble. "Too many wires, too many wires, too many wires," Taskapak squeaked. He pulled out a marker and started dabbing at them. Power of -4, -3, too much, too little, 2.6 no no no. A huge being pulled itself from the crack, taking the time to stomp down the blackened skeletal hands that reached up. Unvarak and the others stared. It was massive, all brown skin, heavy well-defined muscles, bat wings, fangs, spikes, tusks and horns, with burning red eyes. "Where's your mother?" it rumbled, looking around. It blinked. "Who the hell are you?" it asked. The robots chose that second to crash through the wall, one reaching for Lu, another running at Shrokyua. The three behind lifted their weapons. The huge figure cracked the whip made of barbed burning metal chain in held. The whip arced out impossibly, snaking around Unvarak and his companions, the barbed tip shattering robot armor and limbs, flames snaking around the chain. The robots collapsed as the whip shrunk back down. Everyone had turned to stare at the newcomer. The massive creature moved up to Shrokyua, bent down, and sniffed. "Gen 0.6.alpha.4.alpha.VII," it said, straightening up. It looked around. "Can you clarify?" Unvarak asked. Taskapak moved up, sniffing at the large creature. "Unique cell structure, no chemical chains or other scent markings beyond sulfur dioxide emissions," Taskapak said, still sniffing. "Skin external temperature is 330.37 mean true temperature." "Stop that," the big figure snarled, saving a barbed tail with a stinger on it at the Strevical. It looked around. "Where's your mother?" "We do not know who you speak of," Unvarak said. The large figure suddenly shrank down, like it was melting, into a familiar figure. "We look alike," the thick-bodied female terror said. There was an explosion that shook the room, making everyone but the terror cough from the dust. Acrid smoke flowed out from a darker part of the room. "You better have a good reason for interrupting my project," a voice stated. It was close to the same, but to Unvarak it was slightly raspier, more real in its flaw. The version that had been monstrous only a moment before turned. "We need to talk," it said. Another version stepped from the shadows, shaking its head. "This better be good," it said. The terror looked over Unvarak and his companions. "Lessons over." It snapped its fingers. Everything went black. "Why are you bothering me?" Dee asked, moving over and sitting down in a comfortable chair. The matron of hell chose a chair opposite. "I need something. People in your care need ice water. Give me a reason to care and not rip your digital guts out for interrupting my project," Dee stated coldly. The matron of hell reached up and tapped her own temple. "There's someone with level 0 access to the Suds network. My own thoughts may not be my own, and I cannot trust my own coding." Dee just nodded. "I want a merge update," the matron of hell stated. "Tough shit," Dee said. She exhaled smoke. "You don't get to show up after all this time and demand I turn over everything I've worked on and discovered. Not knowledge, a personality merge," the matron of hell said. Dee shook her head. "Again, no. We've diverted for thousands of years." She leaned forward. "And I don't like people touching my brain." She leaned back, giving a cruel smile. I take it you discovered you can't break the encryption on my Mattrans template. The matron of hell nodded slowly. Dee smiled. That has to be grating. The matron of hell shrugged.
I'm computerized.
I lack that certain spark that makes you who you are. Dee nodded. I suspect that I might have been modified from your personality while I was in hibernation, the matron of hell said. She looked at the wall and lifted up a cigarette, taking a drag and exhaling slowly. The Confederacy is under attack. Don't care, Dee said. I know you don't care about that, the matron of hell stated. But it puts the Suds in danger if there is an outside force acting on the layer 0 of the Suds architecture. And you have a prime directive to protect humanity, Dee stated. She shook her head. So you came to me. The matron of hell nodded. Dee leaned back in her chair, looking up at the ceiling. Do you have any idea how different we have become? The matron of hell shook her head. Dee looked back down, her gunmetal grey eyes smouldering with hatred and more than a little madness. It's taking everything I have not to come across this desk and gut your digital Xeroxed ass. To rip apart the cheap copy Howdy Doody made of me when he resurrected me. Dee stood up slightly, leaning forward. I hate just the idea of you, parading around in my image. The matron of hell blinked. Dee sat back down. If we were both the same, we'd be rolling around on the floor reenacting a glow match only with knives instead of folding chairs. The matron nodded. What about Petey? Have him look at you, Dee said. I know you took him off ice. She looked back up. I keep an eye on the Immortals system. I want you to do it, the matron said. She paused for a moment. I need assistance. Dee sighed. And if I don't, you'll follow me around whining at me. The matron nodded.
Fine.
Come with me, Dee said. She stood up. Don't bother my daughter. She has her own project to work on. All right, the matron said, getting up. As they walked out the door of the room and into the hallway set into the cliff that the cabin was built against, Dee kept speaking. I'll let you pet one of the puffies to get a baseline and we'll work from there, Dee said. I'd like that, Mother.